All right. I think we have a good number right now. Welcome again. My name is Anne-Marie, and I'll be your host for today's presentations. And welcome to Magnify. I'll start by just presenting myself and describing myself. So I'm a Black woman. I'm East African, and I'm actually currently in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania in East Africa. I turned 27 last week, and right now I have short Black hair, which is really difficult to to actually manage usually, so that's why I cut it. I'm currently wearing a African print dress, and I wear glasses, these goldish glasses, and I'm currently sitting here in this room in Dar es Salaam. I will also acknowledge the land I'm on, and I encourage all of you to do so. I am right now sitting in Dar es Salaam in East Africa. It's a city called Harbor of Peace, and it's a word. Dar es Salaam is in Arab. It's a mix of Arab and Kiswahili, which is my native language. Dar es Salaam is considered the Southern Agricultural Growth Corridor. It's considered fertile land. It's also a city that represents the Afro-Arab culture fusion, and it's a local manifestation of Creole culture. And again, I encourage you to think of your own city or the land you're standing on. Today we'll be showing 4 recorded talks, and our speakers are also here to respond to your questions. We have this Q&A portion and section on Zoom. You can click and open to see questions or submit them. And the speakers are available during the talk to answer any questions. And we'll also dedicate 15 minutes after all the talks to answer questions live so that they can go over the ones that were answered or answer new ones. And this video is, we have captions as well throughout the presentation. So but you can also go on YouTube and turn on your own video, like your own audio captions if you prefer to do so. And the videos were captioned by humans to make sure that they're precise enough. But we'll be using automatic captioning for the Q&A portion. And we'll be providing a link to all the videos as a playlist. And I see that let's see. Oh, Claudia just sent a list of the presentations today, and we'll also provide a link to the playlist of videos so that you can watch them as well at your own time. And right now, if you want to, you can go to the videos that we're watching and change your captions if you prefer it like that. And since we're a group and a community, and we want to ensure everyone is comfortable, I'm going to go over some of the code of conduct. So Claudia will send a link on our chat to kind of talk about the code of conduct. This is a harassment-free space for everyone, regardless of gender identity, of age, of sexual orientation, of disability, of physical appearance, body size, race, religion, or the lack thereof. So we do not tolerate any form of harassment to any of the participants. And those who do not abide to these rules might be removed from the conference at the discretion of the organizers. And I hope that everyone is, I know that everyone is super open and agreeable, and I don't expect anything to happen, but I just wanted to know that. So thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited for our line of speakers, and we're just about to start. So over the course of the conference, we've learned skills on inclusive design practices and how they can be enhanced. So now we're ready to hear a lot more and even more today with our 4 speakers on how they've championed inclusive design through different case studies. And our first talk is 26 minutes. It will be by Marissa Cummings on Safe Space for Raw Research. And Marissa is a half Taiwanese woman in her 30s. She's seen wearing a gray knitted jumper in front of a wall. And we'll start the video of the presentation by Marissa. Thanks, everyone.
Hello, I am Marissa Cummings, and this is my talk, Safe Spaces for Raw Research for Magnify Conference 2021. So first, just to give you a little bit of background. So this is a little bit about myself. So my background is in software development, design, and product management with a focus on user interface UI design. I am currently a research fellow and designer at the Glasgow School of Art with the Digital Health and Care Innovation Centre, also called DHI, and I care about inclusive, ethical design which empowers communities. And this on the right is a picture of me. So what's this talk about? So it focuses on my recent year-long Masters of Research project, which investigated the design of digital interfaces for health storytelling, working with participants who had multiple chronic health conditions, also called multimorbidity. The project emerged from previous work that DHI had done on patient perspectives and requirements for personal data stores, and this aligns with an area of healthcare practice called narrative medicine, which uses storytelling to promote care and personal well-being. So these are kind of the starting principles which emerged from the literature review that I did at the start of the project and also the previous research that had been done. And this is kind of what I was going into, which informed the design of the methodology. So first, people come first. As designers, we must adopt an empathetic and humanizing approach which prioritizes the needs of individuals over the group. Second, people should have ownership over their care, including their health stories, and be recognized as having lived experience, which gives them expertise. And third, stories can promote well-being, but they can also harm. So a story, for example, which doesn't resonate with someone's personal experience and is then being forced on them has the potential to do great harm to that person. Which kind of, again, underlines the importance of having ownership over their stories. So the literature review kind of dictates a narrative-led approach, but then the question I had was how to fit that in with a human-centered design process, which is a more standard process for digital design. And also, I then had the additional problem of figuring out how to fit myself into this process. So where do I fit in as the researcher and designer? So this was the kind of the problem and the question I had at the start of trying to work out the methodology. So you might be thinking at this stage, but we already use stories in human-centered design, so surely this is not that big of a problem. So yes, we do. So human-centered design already includes a number of tools for stories, such as, and I've listed here some, personas, storyboarding, empathetic design. So why not use these already existing approaches? So first, these tend to be simplified, generalized, and or fictionalized stories. So we take participant stories and then these are often broken down and used as kind of data chunks or sound bites within the project. And this fails to convey the complexity and impact of real experiences. Second, they tend to focus on positive journeys and outcomes, where negative experiences are treated as edge cases. And finally, they give the power to the designer as the participant is only involved in a limited way. And again, in all of this, it's important to remember that health stories can take place over a very long period of time. So again, the size of the story can be quite large and difficult to convey in something as kind of small as a persona. So this is not a new problem, and I've listed here some kind of references which also kind of discuss some of these issues. So Costanza Chalk, 2020, Design Justice, Jones, 2013, Design for Care. This is specifically about healthcare design, so useful for healthcare designers. And also Meyer and Wachter Botker, 2016, Design for Real Life. And I highly recommend this book in particular if you're looking for something which is on the same kind of theme as what I'm talking about, but maybe a little bit more light touch. So the problem isn't a new one, but how do we solve it? So, how can we incorporate stories and participants in our research in a way that preserves emotional impact and participant ownership? Right, so this is kind of showing you the methodology that I used, and I'm going to kind of backtrack and explain this in a lot more detail, but this is just to kind of give you the starting point of what did I actually do. So I had 3 research stages which were repeated individually for each of my 5 participants. The first stage was health storytelling. So this was eliciting the participants' story using a semi-structured interview. And also then using that to develop visual concepts, then using those visual concepts to then inform a process of co-design. So I basically took the visual concepts that I created and broke these down into kind of engagement toolkits for each of the participants. So each participant had their own separate co-design toolkit, which we then used in a workshop to create visual representations of their story. Which I then kind of polished up a bit further and then used to create prototypes. And then in the final workshop, we kind of reflected on what had been created, and I did an additional semi-structured interview to talk about their experiences. And then this all together formed the research findings. And actually in this project, in this presentation, I'm not going to be going that much in depth on the actual research findings because this presentation is more focused on the methodological design, but I've included a link to the full thesis later on in the presentation, so if you're interested you can go and look that up and see more about what I learned from this. So the theoretical stance which I'm adopting here is hermeneutical phenomenology. So you might be thinking, oh, this is over-egging it a bit, but going into this project, it was really important to me to really ground my research theoretically. It's not something which we generally have a chance to do much of in industry. So I really wanted to take the time to really think about my theoretical stance and think about how all these pieces were kind of fitting together and making sure that everything in the methodology was very consistent, rather than kind of the human-centered design approach which we normally use, which is kind of, just picking and choosing our tools as we go along to kind of glean findings to get the outcomes that we want. So a little bit about this theoretical stance. So this is kind of common stance used in phenomenological research, particularly, obviously phenomenological research, but particularly within narrative research. And this positioning allows us to understand that the researcher also exists within the research frame. So we are kind of abandoning any kind of ideas of false objectivity here. So first, it tells us that our understanding of the world is what allows us to understand the experiences of others. So therefore, all research is colored by the experiences and personal biases of the researcher. Second, research exists within a context. So we can understand findings as emerging from a particular place at a particular time with a particular group of people. It's representative of that context. So this is kind of, I guess, talking about this idea of working in dialogue. So using that theoretical stance, and I already showed you the methodology that I use is kind of cyclical working in stages. So this was derived from from sociologist Arthur Frank's idea of dialogical narrative analysis. So I use that to kind of form the basis of the methodology. So He says that first, the research is non-finalizable. No one, especially the researcher, ever has the whole story. The researcher talks with participants, not about them. And the researcher and the participants have mutual recognition. So in other words, there's an understanding that research exists within the context of people's lives and that we acknowledge that context. And the reference here is Frank, 2012, Letting Stories Breathe, a Socio-Narratology. So the primary method that I used was reflexive interviewing. So this is one-to-one interviews, either unstructured or semi-structured. They take place more than once. And again, we acknowledge the presence of the interviewer as a participant in this interview, which is carried out more in conversational terms. So this episodic approach is designed to build trust and create mutual understanding over time. Researchers and participants have periods of reflection in between, and these resting points can also be used by the researcher for further research. So again, this kind of cyclical idea. So the reference again here is Pessoa et al. 2019, using reflexive interviewing to foster deep understanding of research participants' perspectives. And then here, co-creation. So I've not really explained co-creation in much detail, as I'm assuming that most of us kind of have an idea of what this means. But this is more reflecting on the fact that co-creation processes are not inherently empowering. So attention still needs to be paid to explicit and ongoing consent from participants, the accessibility and safety of tools, and also the participant-researcher power dynamics. So we can't just put people in a room together and just automatically participants are empowered. We need to think about how are they accessing things? Are they able to participate in the co-design process on a kind of equal level with the researcher? So references here, Sanders and Stapmer's 2008, Co-Creation and the New Landscapes of Design, and Schweitzer 2017, What's in an Image Towards a Critical and Interdisciplinary Reading of Participatory Visual Methods. So this is kind of going more in depth on what I just discussed on kind of issues of accessibility and safety. So my project was carried out under COVID lockdown. So all of my engagements with participants had to be remote. So pros to this are that participants are in a safe space, which is already adjusted to be physically comfortable for them. In other words, they're home. There is no need for participants to travel, and it is easier to fit activities around existing commitments, and it's potentially a more inclusive approach as there is a lower barrier to entry. So for example, I had participants talk to me while their children were being cared for in the other room. I had one participant that I interviewed while she was like tucked up under a blanket on her sofa. So it's creating a much higher level of physical comfort than we could possibly achieve in like a workspace, for example. The cons is that it's harder to get hands-on engagement without tactile elements. And also, technical tools need to be carefully considered for security and participant capabilities, so as not to be excluding. So this is further expanding on the consent, which I talked about earlier in co-creation. So the process I use is called dynamic consent. So dynamic consent is explicit, it's specific, and it's ongoing. So this project included 2 formal checkpoints with signed consent forms at the start and the middle of the project, and also 3 informal checkpoints, one after each research stage, to review what had been produced and consent to its inclusion in the project. So in other words, after each engagement, I would go away, I would do analysis on what we had done and pull together kind of all the stuff that we had produced. All of that would then be sent over to the research participant for them to review. So they would have the opportunity to look over everything that we had produced and kind of individually say, oh, you know, I'm okay with this being included. I don't want that to be included, what have you. So this gives them a great deal of kind of comfort and safety, and that they know they can say or do anything within that kind of engagement, and that it won't necessarily be included in the project. They have space to go away and reflect and then later think, oh, I didn't actually want that included. So the reference here is Bustamante Duarte et al. 2019 Safe Spaces in Participatory Design with Young Forced Migrants. And this project uses this type of consent, so this is a good model if you're interested in learning more about this. And then where do we sit within this process? How do we care for ourselves and participants during emotional research? So, ethnographer Carolyn Ellis argues that maintaining an objective distance from participants during highly emotional research is unethical and can cause participants greater harm. And I like this quote from Finley to kind of illustrate this. Research does not involve a participant subject talking/telling to a passive and distant researcher. Instead, what is revealed emerges out of a constantly evolving, negotiated, dynamic, co-created relational process to which both researcher and participant co-researcher contribute. So this is, again, we're getting into this idea of a relationship being formed between the researcher and the participant, and that this is actually part of the research. So my references here are Ellis, 2004, The Ethnographic Eye, a methodological novel about autoethnography, a great resource for doing emotional research, and also just an entertaining read. And Finley, 2009, Ambiguous Encounters, a relational approach to phenomenological research. And then this kind of sums it up, this quote. So this is talking about a stance of friendship in research. So she says, for a mutual, close, and or lasting friendship to develop between every researcher and all participants is unrealistic. Regardless, we can approach respondents from a stance of friendship, meaning we treat them with respect, honor their stories, and try to use their stories for humane and just purposes. And this is from Tillman Healy, 2003, Friendship as Method. So I think this really just sums up kind of what I think the stance should be of a researcher in this type of research process. We're not necessarily expecting participants to be friends with us, but we're treating them as if they are our friends with the same level of kind of respect and consideration that we would give to our friends. And then also, I think really importantly is the necessity of including researcher processing and self-care into this process. So I've included some things that I've done, and hopefully these will help you. So first could be mindfully reflecting on the session, the person you are working with, using a stance of friendship and humility, being aware of one's attitude, using structured or semi-structured journaling to record notes on the session and personal reflections, and also within ethical boundaries, processing emotions and doing supportive self-care activities with other researchers or friends and family. So again, this preserving participant anonymity and whatever else you may need to do to preserve the ethics of your project, but still taking time to kind of process and reflect on what you've learned with other people if you can. So references here, Malacrida, 2007, Reflexive Journaling on Emotional Research Topics, Ethical Issues for Team Researchers. And also Yeager and Barrow, 2013, Cultural Humility, Essential Foundation for Clinical Researchers. So I'm going to go over here one of my participants' stories, and this is just to give you an idea of how basically their story was translated in the kind of the process, the research process end to end, and what that actually looks like. So this is my participant Ted Head. This is obviously a pseudonym. All my participants here are identified with pseudonyms, and this is the pseudonym he selected. So Ted Head is a 53-year-old man. He was diagnosed with myalgic encephalomyelitis, also called ME, sometimes referred to as chronic fatigue syndrome, and chronic depression, as well as irritable bowel syndrome, IBS. Before becoming ill, Ted had worked as a medical engineer. He loved to sail, but had to sell his boat after he became too unwell to use it. And this is kind of a quote from his initial interview. He talked a lot about hope and the necessity of hope. And one of the things he talked about was this song, Mary Ellen Carter, which is a song about a boat. He loves boats, so he said, I've known the song Mary Ellen Carter for a long time. Biographically, the ship in the song represents your life. That's what the singer is intending, that it represents your life and the battles in your life. But the thing about that song is that it offers hope. There's hope that the ship can be rescued and returned to service, that you can go and return to your normal life. Unfortunately, in ME, there is no such hope. You have to live with the constraints that you now find yourself in because there isn't even a treatment, let alone a cure. But that, for me, is too negative. I have to live with some hope, and that song is the song of hope. So after the initial kind of interview with him, this is a screenshot of some of the visual kind of representations I did for the co-creation workshop. So this is kind of from the co-creation workshop, some of the kind of rough stuff that we came up with. And apologies, this is a little blurry, but it just kind of gives you an idea of what the process was looking like at that stage. And then this was actually what we produced at the end after co-creating and then engagements. Then this is actually what came out of it. So this is this idea of a kind of ship's log representation of a health story. We have a hope flower on the side, which Ted had talked about the need to kind of nurture hope and care for it. So we have it represented as a plant. He also did a great deal of research himself about his condition. So he wanted a place to store that research. So we had an idea of research rutters based on the idea of a ship's rudder, where he could kind of store research that he had done. So this is showing a screenshot of the kind of landing page with the kind of overall log with different entries. This is a screenshot of an individual entry. So an idea of it for an individual entry layout. And then this is kind of what a research rudder might look like, with kind of different links and resources kind of in there that he could kind of manage those. And of course, as Arthur Frank says, the stories are never they're non-finalizable, so they continue. So since the project finished, I've kept in touch with Ted Head. His health has significantly improved after undergoing a treatment procedure last year. He actually recently bought a new boat, and he sent me a picture of himself sailing, which was lovely. And all of the kind of the full stories can be found in my thesis, which is this link. So it's radar.gsa.ac.uk/7525. So you can go there to find out more. And so what did I learn from all of this? So this is kind of what participants thought about it. They really enjoyed the process. Overall, the feedback I got was very positive. They were very invested, and they enjoyed seeing how their stories evolved. And at the end, each participant got a personalized booklet with their story. So this is a quote from my participant, Sharon, talking about what she thought about it. She said, "I'm quite amazed at what you've been able to achieve from just a couple of chats between us. It's difficult to think back now to the first meeting, which was the most intense one, I think. It was trying to find a way to relate my story to you. But I do remember at the time thinking even having done that was a useful process to go through. It's a long time since I've done that, if ever." So even getting the chance to kind of share their stories with me was actually really important to them. So closing thoughts about all of this. So the initial challenge I had was to incorporate an emotional narrative research process into a human-centered digital approach. So I achieved this by giving participants a safe private space to share their stories with me, ensuring that they retained ongoing ownership of their stories through a dialogical research process using dynamic consent, approaching participants from a stance of friendship and respect, and also giving participants control over the direction of the work and final validation of the work. So I wanted to kind of touch on the emotional impact of doing this. So doing this type of deep, sustained reflection with participants gave really deep emotional insights, as I hope you kind of saw from that the short quote that I included from Ted Head's interview. And it's difficult to imagine participants sharing that type of information in a group setting. Undertaking a project of this type really had a huge impact on myself as a researcher. to listen to someone's health story is to hear about some of the most difficult times in someone's life. And it wasn't uncommon for participants to start crying while they were telling me their stories. So it's quite difficult and emotional for me to listen to. And these stories, the themes of hope and despair, go straight to the heart, I think, of what it means to be human. And I feel, and I hope you feel, that the final outputs resonate with kind of these stories. So that is the conclusion of my talk. So if you are interested in following up, I've included here my email address, which is m.cummings@gsa.ac.uk. And you can also find me on Twitter at mcc_Cummings. Thank you very much.
Wow, that was amazing. Thank you, Marissa, for your presentation on safe spaces for raw research. Yeah, I would love to sit down and ask you a bunch of questions, and I think that's some of the audience as well. Thank you again for your time and for just being here. And hopefully, if anyone has questions for Marissa, you can send them in the Q&A panel, so that once she's ready to answer them at the end, we can tackle them. Thank you so much again, Marissa. And now we're going to move to our second talk. And this one is going to be 13 minutes. It's titled Design Research for Social Taboos by two speakers, Ankita Mirani and Apoorva Jain. Let me know if I said those correctly. And yes, and Ankita is an Indian woman in her late 20s. She has long hair that is black and a little wavy. She's wearing a red checkered sleeveless jumpsuit, and she's sitting on a black chair in a room with a whiteboard behind her. And Apoorva is an Indian woman in her mid-20s. She has shoulder-length straight hair. She's wearing a white top with blue design on it. She's also wearing glasses and sitting with a white background behind her. So let's hear both of the speakers on design research for social taboos.
Hi there. We want to ask you something. What comes to your mind when we say diabetes? Probably some relative that you know that has dietary restrictions, especially around sugar, is it? Let's take a journey together, shall we? Before we begin, let's take a moment and take a deep breath. Go on, do it. Now, go ahead and pinch yourself. It can be anywhere, your arm, thighs, abdomen. Feel the pinch. So do it a little bit harder. Now, let's pin somebody next to you. Hesitant much? We thought so. Now, let's think of a child that you know. It could be anybody, your son, daughter, niece, nephew, that cute little neighbor, or the kid that you saw at the supermarket. Now, imagine them being pinched. Ouch. Don't like the thought of that. Well, we don't either. But that's the reality of a child with type 1 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is when pancreas in your body fail to produce insulin and is a lifelong condition. Since their childhood, people with type 1 prick themselves several times a day. Sometimes to give themselves insulin because they need it for survival, or sometimes just to check their sugar levels in a day. The sugar levels in our body is affected literally by everything that we do. Since we mentioned earlier that this condition affects children that are quite young to take such responsibilities, it's usually the mothers that take care of the condition on their kids' behalves. Now let's take a look at what the mother's journey is like. Now, just being a mother means switching between multiple roles, and the condition adds its own share of things to take care of. Now, a mother has to be mindful about every little minute detail of the child's life, like what the child is eating, is he exercising, hoping he's not exercising too much, constantly checking the sugar levels to make sure they're under normal range, and the list goes on and on. And if that was not enough, being a mother of a type 1 child in India adds its own share of challenges. Now, they're not just battling all of the worries that comes along with it. They're battling a lot of societal taboos that People usually look at as a limitation, and life events now become battles that these mothers have to fight. Worrying about an inclusive school or their marriage, or worrying about their kids' acceptance in the society, or even their own acceptance in the society leaves these mothers in an exhausting situation. Well, that's exactly what it feels like being a mother of a type 1 constantly. But you're constantly dodging everyone's opinions and advices while trying to stay focused on your child health. The minute we recognized this struggle, we knew we had to do something about it. So we took a designed research approach to address this challenge and started looking at how could we help these primary caretakers. Let's see what we found out. So we began with researching about the condition, the problem, the existing solutions to the condition, and understanding the challenge in depth. We did a qualitative and a quantitative study. We hosted multiple interviews with mothers, some experts, and even people who've been living with the condition for a while. We were looking for the right questions to ask so we could solve for them. That was the first phase that was explore and identify. Once we knew what were the right questions to ask, what were the right challenges we needed to solve for, we moved to phase 2, where we started ideating about them and co-creating it with our users and within the team. Once we knew what concepts worked or what concepts we wanted to go ahead with, we moved on to our third phase, which was testing them and putting them out there for our users to see what works and what doesn't work with them, and eventually scaling it up to the larger audience. Let's look at it a little bit more in depth. So for the first phase, what were the right questions to ask and how did we get to them? Through a lot of secondary research, we found out that there are about 700,000 type 1 diabetic children in India. And globally, there are about 1.1 million children that suffer from this condition. The reason this condition needed better management was because a child typically loses 20 years of their lives if they're diagnosed with type 1. And it could be worse if not managed well. Then we looked at what were the barriers that were stopping these primary caretakers from managing the condition well for their kids. There were gaps majorly around 2 issues that hindered the management. One was not knowing what to do when something was happening to their kids and not knowing what was really happening in their child's body. And the other bit was because they lacked motivation and support to constantly stay consistent in this journey of management. As we've seen, it's an exhausting and an extensive journey. Now, it wasn't just about the barriers. We were also looking at what kind of things really worked well. So we looked at some things that were working well for these mothers and that helped them get through this journey a little bit better. Not surprisingly enough, we realized that it was meaningful human interactions and connections that got them through. Whether it was through other people, family, experts, or even especially the other experienced mothers. So now we knew that we needed to enable and empower the mothers with the right information and support for a well-managed diabetes. This is what we were able to sum up in the explore and identify stage. And then once we knew this is what we were solving for, we moved on to the next phase. Over to you, Apoorva, to help us take us through the second phase.
We're going to talk about our second phase, which is ideating and co-creating, where we arrived at our problem statement and started solving for that. So we arrived at a brief as to how might we empower the primary caretakers to manage the condition well. While we were delving deep into understanding the complication and the experiences that the primary caretakers were going through, we realized that there are multiple gaps. Firstly, it's a complex condition to understand for newly diagnosed parents. There are multiple sources through which this information is available, and the credibility of the source is at question. It is heavy text and filled with jargon, therefore it becomes difficult for the parents to comprehend. Most of the information we see is in English, therefore creating a language barrier, which rules out people from different communities. We also understood that there is limited emotional support. So after analyzing the gaps and after a million brainstorming sessions later, we realized that we're looking at a solution that is holistic and comprehensive guide to everything that is type 1 diabetes, which is easy to understand and is fun and not overwhelming. We were looking for something that has more of a personalized approach and not in a textbook format. Something that is verified by experts, and most importantly, something that facilitates support within the community and experts. So moving into the direction of solution, we realized that we were solving for essentially 2 things. Firstly, access to right information and tools. And secondly, how can we provide community and expert support? So around the information, we drafted our first brief, which was how might we take the right information and tools accessible to the primary caretakers. But what is the information that the primary caretakers need to manage the condition well and holistically? So this was the question that we were thinking about. Now, type 1 is a long-term condition, and there are various aspects that goes into managing the condition. So we took these aspects and divided them into 5 segments. We began with care, medical and emotional, then diet, fitness, lifestyle, and parenting. While we were curating the information, now was the turn where we were thinking that how do we educate the primary caretakers? That is essentially our mothers. We came up with an interactive online program, which is called Mellitus Moms. The project's aim wasn't to share information to be able to treat the children, but to be able to make positive change in their day-to-day lives, and even harder, sustain those changes. This approach was rooted in capabilities, where the idea is not to patch up their needs, but foster the capabilities of the primary caretakers, that are our mothers. And that was achieved by 2 things: access to right information and facilitating constant community support. So what does that look like? The information comes in the form of an app. What you see here is a topic from the program broken down into simplistic form. We made sure that the information is not text heavy and communicates the concepts visually. Along with that, we had an added feature for our users to be able to go through the information through an audio guide. The content designed here is in English. We realized that the language preferred by our user group is a mix of both Hindi and English. We also added interactive bits such as stories from personal accounts, myths, mythbusters, hacks to make it a personalized experience. Now that we were looking into information, we came to our second brief: how might we enable the community to support each other? We realized that we're looking for something which can create meaningful experiences within the community through consistent online interactions. And what does that look like? So we hosted multiple workshops on various topics with our experienced mothers and the primary caretakers. So the primary caretakers, we call them as super moms, and the experienced mothers and experts, we call them as Mellitus gurus. Bringing on experienced mother was a major breakthrough for us because that gave the super moms confidence that they're not alone in this journey. We also realized that initially that the mothers were hesitant in sharing their stories, but we could see a gradual improvement with each session. And that was because the Mellitus gurus really helped us build stronger connection. That was also because they could relate to the experienced mothers, our super moms. So workshop was one bit. We also have WhatsApp group where we try to create interactions. And here we share useful information in different formats. So here we're sharing recipes. We've hosted multiple campaigns like around diet and festivals. And we also like to celebrate different achievements from super kids and super moms. The idea is to create engagement and build a stronger community. Now, because it is around engagement, how do we know that it's working? So here is an example where we're creating organic everyday interaction. So here the supermoms took the ownership and they started sharing videos from their everyday lives. And this created a lot of engagement on our WhatsApp group. Now this is our third stage, and over to you, Ankita.
So then let's talk about the third phase, where we really test our ideas out with a larger audience and scale it up. Everything that you've seen so far has been from our testing phase. All of the testimonials, all of the videos and pictures that you saw were while we were co-creating these modules with our users. Now, our solution currently focuses on tier 2 cities, and we are scaling it up as we go. So like you saw, all of these were in a language that was preferred to that audience. It was designed in a manner which was visually appealing more to our audience than focusing on an overall aesthetic. We are also currently building our MVP, a minimum viable product, which would be able to help us reach out to more mothers as we go. And it should be live in a couple of months. We are willing to design whatever it takes to help them. And the idea is to make sure that every person that's impacted by type 1 has at least access to the right knowledge and support that they need for this journey. We advocate the idea of no person left behind. We've just begun to showcase our insights and what our journey looks like online. So if you want to, please join us on this journey there, and you will be able to see how the rest of the story unfolds. With that, we are at the end of this talk from our side. And as we close, we're wishing you a healthier and a happier future.
Ooh, I loved how energetic both of them were. Thank you so much for your presentation, Ankita and Apoorva. Apoorva, sorry. Thank you again for your presentation. It was so insightful. And one thing that I mentioned in a comment in the chat is the fact that you use like a really accessible tool like WhatsApp that we use on a day-to-day. And I see it here in East Africa that people use WhatsApp so much. And so it's easy, it's such a simple tool, and sometimes we kind of want to complicate things, but you made them really simple by using something that most people use to get in touch with them. And now we're going to go into our break. It's now, is it 4 or 3:47? I think, right? 3:47. We'll take a 10-minute break. So we'll be back around, let's say 3:57 or maybe 4 p.m. specifically. So yeah, we'll meet again in 10-ish minutes. So see you, and thank you again for being here. And once we come back, we'll go through the next talks. We'll have 2 more before the end of the conference. So see you soon. All right. It's 4 p.m. We are back. Sorry if you hear like noise on my side. There's construction outside, so you might hear some background noise. But if you do not hear anything, that's great. It means it doesn't actually come out in the microphone. We're back from the break, and we're ready for our third talk today. And this one is going to be 21 minutes by Emma Parnell, and it's on the subject, let's talk about sex. So let me describe Emma. So Emma is a white woman in her 30s with long blonde hair and glasses. She's wearing pale green jumper, and she's in a spare room. She just moved house, so there are paint swatches on the wall and pictures on the floor, plus a chest of drawers with a plant, and I believe she's in London. So let's hear Emma on Let's Talk About Sex.
Hi everybody, my name's Emma Parnell, and I am head of design of a company called Joy. Joy is a company I really recently launched, and we combine brand development with service design to ensure that customers can get their needs met and companies can deliver on their promises. Before setting up Joy, I worked as a service design lead at NHS Digital. I worked in the bit of the organisation called Citizen Health Tech, and we designed and delivered citizen-facing products and services. As part of my time there, I worked on the service that allowed people to book an appointment for a COVID-19 vaccination. And as part of that work, I faced a challenge around sex and gender, which is what I'm going to talk to you about today. So before I tell you the story of what happened, I want to set a little bit of context. So most of you here will probably know this, but I think it's a really good reminder to remind ourselves of the difference between sex and gender and the fact that these things are not the same. So when it comes to sex, we're talking about the biological aspects of an individual determined by their anatomy. The terms usually used are male or female, and this is something that is assigned at birth. Whereas gender is a social construct. It relates to behaviours, attitudes, and labels of masculinity and femininity. A person's gender may not be binary. They may identify along a spectrum, and importantly, somebody's gender may not match the sex that they were assigned at birth. So the reason I start by talking about this is that the work that we did and the problem we faced, something that underpinned that was that sex and gender were being conflated. So as I said previously, it's important to remember that they are not the same thing. So another bit of context I like to include when I tell this story is about the fact that sadly, we're not living in a society where everybody is treated equally at the moment. The trans population especially are facing a really difficult time with the rise of transphobia. People are really struggling. I'm not going to read all of these stats out that are on the screen, but they begin to paint a picture for you of the struggles that people are having. The stats I'm about to show are taken from Stonewall's LGBT in Britain report that came out a couple of years ago. And the reason I talk about this is when we work in government on services, often people will bring stats up like what is on the screen, a stat that says that around 1% of the population might identify as trans or non-binary. And people can dismiss that. People can say 1% is really small. You know, we don't have to worry about those people. But, you know, in the case of national scale services, this could equate to hundreds of thousands of people. And even if it didn't equate to hundreds of thousands of people, each one of those people is a person with a family and a story and feelings, and they are important. So as I said, people are suffering. People are experiencing hate crime because of their gender. People are experiencing homelessness. These are really sad statistics to have to put on the screen, but it's the reality of what is happening to people right now. And it's especially hard for people in healthcare. Almost half of trans people say that healthcare staff lack understanding of specific trans health needs when they're attempting to access the healthcare that they need. And one of the main reasons why I want to highlight this is that my dad is trans. My dad is one of those 600,000 plus people, one of the people who has a family and a story and feelings. And when you're designing for that 1%, I want you to think of the humans behind those figures. So coming to the story, this was a piece of work that we did as part of the work to design the national booking service for coronavirus vaccinations, as I said. So this is a service that is still live now. If you haven't booked or had 1 or 2 doses of the COVID-19 vaccine, you can access it via the NHS website and you can book your appointments. And this is a service I worked as part of the team to do the initial design and delivery of towards the back end of last year, so kind of September through to December last year before it launched. And as part of that work, we found out that we faced a problem, and this became apparent to us only maybe kind of 2-3 weeks before the initial go live date of the service. And we found out that we might have to ask people about their gender while accessing this service. And I was very keen to understand why we had to ask somebody that when all they were doing was booking an appointment. And if you've used the service, you'll know that there are 2 routes into the service, basically. We need to identify you when you're coming in to book that appointment. And to do that, we connect to an infrastructure service called the Personal Demographic Service. That's another service used by and delivered by NHS Digital. It's known as PDS. And we look someone up on that database. It's basically the database that holds the NHS numbers. We look someone up on that either by you entering your NHS number or by entering a series of demographic details about yourself. And we know from research that not everybody knows their NHS number. So we had to build a second route for people to enter a series of demographic details about themselves. We could find you that way. We found out kind of at the final hour, as I said, that one of those details would need to be gender. And the reason why was because it was a mandatory field in the matching process for the API. So an API connects one system to another, and it had built in a mandatory requirement for gender in that matching process. This was problematic. As I said, we were not asking for clinical or monitoring purposes. We just wanted to let someone book an appointment. So this is not something we need to know about somebody at that particular point in their vaccination journey. Another problem was that the data we had to play with was not particularly inclusive. So the data held on PDS is labeled gender, but the attributes held talk to somebody's sex. So there are 4 attributes on PDS, male, female, unspecified, and unknown. As you can imagine, the last 2 are not particularly helpful. So these things combined made it very difficult to design an inclusive front-end screen for this service. So to start with, we wanted to explore whether there was a technical solution that we could implement, something we could do kind of under the hood, if you like, to ensure that we didn't have to ask the question in the first instance. And this was a point where I worked very closely with our technical architects, so design and technical architecture working in really close collaboration to look at options. And we knew that other services had faced this challenge in the past, and previously one of the things they'd done was the API would basically do 4 calls. So it would look for people until they found them. And this was something other services had done, but our service was very high profile at the time. We were unsure how people were going to use it. We were unsure how many people would need to use it at the same time. And because of that, there was a lot of caution around performance, a lot of worries that the service would fall over if too much load was put on it. So for that reason, these solutions that we were coming up with were deemed to be too much of a performance risk. So because of that, we accepted that we would have to ask the question. So we worked as a real multidisciplinary team on the design of the screen. We knew this wouldn't be the first time someone had faced this, so we drew on existing knowledge and research from inside and outside of the NHS. We worked very closely with the LGBT health team in NHS England. They advised us throughout and gave us brilliant advice. And our content community especially had faced challenges like this in the past and had existing experience that we could draw on. So with this in mind, we designed what we felt was quite an inclusive solution to begin with, and we then wanted to put that into research. So we worked with our user researchers to recruit trans and non-binary people to do research with. We had very limited time for this. From the moment we found out to the moment we had to lock down development for go live, we had a maximum 2 weeks, I think probably less than that. So it just shows you can always make time for user research, and you always should make time for user research, especially on something as important as this. So this was the screen that we took to research. We were very specific about not using the terms sex or gender in the question because of the reason I explained at the start, because of the conflation between the two. We wanted to make sure that we explained why we're asking. This was a challenge because obviously it's kind of real reason is because we have to match to this other kind of fairly uninclusive system that we have in place, which is difficult to explain sometimes. And we offered the users 5 options. So users could choose female, male, non-binary, prefer not to say, or how I self-describe does not match my GP record. And we took this into research and thankfully it tested pretty well. We only had the time to test with 5 people, but that is the numbers we do user research in. We test with 5 and then we iterate and we test with 5 more. And it tested really well. One of the sad things I think it made me realize was that the bar is fairly low for people in this situation. They don't expect much. So when we showed them this screen, people were actually surprised. So the quote on the screen reads, "If anything, it made me feel more like the things that are going on are being done by people who know what they're doing." Another situation that we were really keen to design for was people going through transition. We knew that in this situation, people would be well aware of what was on their GP record and may be well aware that what was on their record may not match how they currently identify. We didn't want people to face that barrier when booking an appointment. So we did the work to ensure that there would be an option for those people to select. So in this case, the quote reads, "I would click female, but in January 2018, I started male to female transition and pretty much all my documents say I am female. But for some strange reason, my medical records still state me as male. If I was to click female, which to all intents and purposes I am, I might not match up." So as I said, the solution tested really well. We didn't make many changes off the back of the user research. I think we tweaked some of the content. But just to explain how the solution works, and this is where the collaboration between design and technical architecture was really important, because the way the screen works is if you select male or female, which a high proportion of the population will, the system does one API call and it will find you. But if you select any of the third, fourth, or fifth options, so non-binary, prefer not to say, or how I self-describe my not match my GP record, that's when we do the 4 API calls. And that was allowed to go through from performance perspective because there was an assumption that there would be a smaller percentage of the population selecting those options. So that's what we launched with. The service went live in January of this year, and we were really pleased to receive some positive feedback. Not long after launch, Tash, who we worked with in the LGBT health team, kindly forwarded this quote onto me. So it reads, "Just thought I would let you know that we had an email from a non-binary person this week who was considering not accessing a vaccination due to having to select a binary gender option in their local system and the dysphoria this would cause. After pointing them in the direction of the main system and the work you had done, they got back to me to say they had managed to book one and thanking us and you for the inclusive options they could select." So this was really heartening for us. We were glad that the work we'd put into the design of the screen had paid off. We did, however, encounter some problems, and this was feedback we picked up anecdotally, actually, about what was happening in the call centre. So the system that we designed was also used by the call centre staff to book people in over the phone. So a slightly different instance of the technology with a few things removed, but for the most part, the same system. And we heard that staff were finding it uncomfortable to read the question over the phone because of the way it was worded. They found that it confused some users. At this point, the majority of the users booking appointments were older people because of the way that the age-based rollout happened. We also heard that some call centre staff were avoiding asking the question and making assumptions based on the sound of people's voices, which was fairly concerning. So there was a clear need for LGBTQ awareness training here, and a real need to design the kind of citizen-facing digital channel and the phone channel in parallel, something that we had let slip during a moment of panic and stress, I think it's fair to say. So if we were keeping the question in the service, this is something I would have pursued and looked to work with the call centre staff on to improve. However, I had bigger fish to fry, and my focus at that point was to make the case to remove it. So I actually moved off the programme when the service launched, but I was not happy that the service had gone live with this question in. And I started doing the work to build the momentum and awareness needed to make the case, basically. And the case needed to be made in 2 different places. Firstly, it did help that the issue kind of did end up going right to the top of the organisation. We were working on a really high profile service at the time, probably the most important thing going on in the organisation. And I was able to use this as a springboard to get people's attention around it. It then became apparent that there were 2 teams that needed to do the work. So the team that work on the personal demographic service, they build, maintain, develop the API. And that is where the change needed to happen in order to remove the mandatory matching aspect. But we also needed to do further development work to take the question out of the service, something that is quite hard to make the case for when you're living in a really chaotic, stressful, everything is urgent type environment like we were at the time with the booking service. So making the case to do some development work to remove something is not easy to make the case for. But, you know, always continuing to push and highlight and escalate the importance of inclusion is something we all really need to do, and something I continue to do until, thankfully, I was successful. So the 2 changes did get made. The PDS change was made first, which was great news. And then about 3 or 4 weeks later, the booking service team made the second change, which meant at that point that the question was able to be removed. So I think it was live in the booking service for about 8-9 weeks in the end. But then the most important thing, I think, with this work is that we made a change to kind of underlying infrastructure, not just the service itself. While it was great to get it removed from that service, the wider benefits were the important thing. You know, we had people from other services reaching out to us saying, oh, now you've made that change to the API, can we use that API? Can we take the question out of our service? You know, COVID-19 testing services had already faced some pressure to change the way they were asking the question from LGBT rights groups, and rightly so. So, you know, they went on a journey themselves, looking at different ways they could redesign the question. They were facing slightly different technical constraints to us at the time. We also had people reach out around the electronic staff record in the NHS. And if I had stayed in the NHS, I probably would have gone knocking on the doors of 111 online, because I know it features there as well. We also had people reach out from across government. So, you know, this was work that resonated with other parts of the system in terms of facing quite challenging technical constraints from existing infrastructure services that were, I guess, holding them back in terms of making their services as inclusive as they could be. We had a really interesting conversation with the team who were building the National Insurance Number service, for example. And I think that's the main message I want to leave people with when I tell this story, is that as a design community, as a kind of agile product development community, we're getting pretty good at designing inclusive front-end services. There's always work we can do. There's always things we can make more accessible, etc. However, we have improved a lot over the years. Where I think we need to really now turn our attention is to mounting the case for changing these outdated infrastructure systems, because they often sit under multiple services. And if those services can work together and make a collective case for why these systems are holding us back, why they're not allowing us to be as inclusive as we would like to be in the design of those front-end screens, that's when we really start making the change that we want to see, in my opinion. Thank you very much for listening. If you'd like to contact me for anything at all, then my details are on the screen. My Instagram is Design for Joy Ltd with underscores between the words. Twitter, worddoodles_EP, and you can find my website at designforjoy.co.uk. Thank you very much for listening.
So that was Emma on her presentation, Let's Talk About Sex. And she mentioned gender and sexuality and infrastructures, which I find really interesting, that we usually don't think about this when it's time to design, of like the actual infrastructure of where things are built. So I think that was super brilliant. Sorry if you hear background noise again, there's the evening prayer happening in Dar es Salaam. And so you might hear some chants in the back. Thanks again, Emma. If you have questions for her, feel free to submit them in the Q&A panel, or if you prefer to send them in a chat, and we'll find a way for her to respond to them during the other talks, and after, once we kind of dedicate some time to respond to the questions. But now we're going to move to our fourth and final talk by Tyler Gindraux, and it's called Designing the Participant Experience at the Royal National Institute for Deaf People. And it's going to be 10 minutes. And Tyler is a white woman in her late 20s. She wears glasses and has short brown wavy hair. She's wearing a button brown checkered tunic with a cream shirt on top. She's standing in her living room with a few plants behind her. So let's hear from Tyler on designing the participant experience at the Royal National Institute for Deaf People.
Hi, I'm Tyler. I'm from the Royal National Institute for Deaf People, also known as RNID, based in the UK. I'm a user researcher And my day-to-day involves learning from people who might use our services to gather their experiences and their needs. Today, I'm going to share a look into how we design the experience of taking part in research at RNID. So first, I'm going to show you how we think about research from the participant's point of view. Then I'll share how this helps us create a better experience for the people who take part in our research. And to finish, I'll go through some examples of how we're improving. So when was the last time you took part in research? I think when we're researchers more often than we're participants, it's easy to forget what it's like to take part in research. But to provide a good experience for the people who take part in our research, it's important we learn to see it from their point of view. So how do we do that? So here's how I'm learning to see research from a participant's point of view. When I start a research project or enter a new territory, I create a map. I use the map to illustrate different stages, the activities at each stage, and then the touch points or interactions within them. The map shows the journey someone goes on when they take part in research. So here I've mapped a pretty common participant experience. There's 6 stages in this journey. From left to right, they say becoming aware, getting involved, preparing, taking part, after taking part, and getting involved again. So after I map the stages, I consider the detail. From a participant's point of view, what's happening at each stage. So we often talk about user research as an event. It's an interview, a workshop, a usability test. But mapping the experience encourages me to think about participating in research as a journey, not an event. It also helps me to move beyond focusing on the moments when I'm personally involved as the researcher towards understanding the full experience from a participant's point of view. Once we've mapped the experience, it becomes easier to identify opportunities for improving or learning more. So after I create the map, I look for moments where we can improve or where we need to learn more. Sometimes it's about looking across the stages in the journey. Other times it's about understanding the specific touch points or interactions within one stage. The more detailed the map and the more I know about the people who take part, the easier it is to identify moments of impact. So let's look at how we're improving the stage where someone gets involved in research at RNID. So this is when we'd like to find out if someone's a good fit for a research study. It's also when people let us know if they'd like to take part and how. How can we make this more safe, accessible, respectful, or welcoming? So at this stage, to find opportunities, I ask questions like, can people make fully informed decisions in their preferred language? Have we anticipated people's needs, and are they encouraged to communicate them too? Are we flexible enough? Can people make their own choices? So here's some of the ideas that come out of that process. At this stage, we think we should give information early on that's reassuring, informative, and accessible. Ask for consent in people's preferred language. Allow people to communicate their needs, but offer informed options too. So at RNID, we've redesigned our consent form and our information sheet. This is so we can ask better questions, communicate more clearly, and offer choice. Our materials also show now that we have an understanding of the needs of deaf people and people with hearing loss, while also encouraging them to communicate their needs to us. And another thing we've looked at was how people are giving consent. Now, people who use British Sign Language as a first language are asked for their consent in BSL. So let's look at how we're improving the stage when someone's taking part. So this is when someone takes part in the engagement. So often we're asking them a series of questions, we're having someone review existing materials, or we're asking them to create new ones. How can we make this more safe, accessible, respectful, or welcoming? Here, to find opportunities, I asked questions like, is the space set up to support the person taking part? Have we asked how they identify, or do we know which language we should use? Have we considered how to work best with the communication support professionals? And so again, asking questions help to bring some ideas to the surface. At this stage, we think we should set up a deaf-friendly space, whether online or in person. Ask people to identify themselves and reflect the language they use. And then work with the communication support in a collaborative way. So at RNID, we considered what a deaf-friendly space might look like online. That includes the way we use screen sharing, how we prioritize someone's access to an interpreter through usability tests, for example, and even things like the lighting and the setup of our own space before we join a video call. We also considered how we write our discussion guides. So now at the start of every session, we'll ask people to identify themselves and we'll use the language they use through the rest of the conversation. And finally, we've looked at the way we work with communication support professionals. The more we can inform them before research begins, the better equipped they are to help us deliver the interviews. It's important that interpreters know why we're asking certain questions so they can interpret the meaning in sign language. So finally, let's look at how we're improving the stage after someone takes part. So this is when we offer our thanks and payment for participating. It also might be the last time we communicate with someone, so we make sure they have all the information they need. How can we make this more safe, accessible, respectful, or welcoming? Here, I ask questions like, have we given people the resources they might need? Will people leave feeling fully informed if they want to be? Is it clear that people are in control of their own information? And how are we showing people that we value their participation? And again, asking questions at this stage made us think we should give people the option to stay informed, ensure that any outputs we share are accessible, and support people if they want to share their story more widely. So we redesigned the end of our communication with the participants. Now at the end of any engagement, we ask people if they'd like to stay informed of our key learnings. We make sure they know this is optional and it will be provided in plain English and British Sign Language. We're also thinking about ways people can give us feedback once we share these learnings and how we can make this process more accessible to BSL users. And finally, our first priority as researchers is often to keep people safe. This includes keeping their identity and their information anonymous. That being said, we think it's important to recognize that some people want to share their stories more widely to inspire others or promote change. By letting them know that this is an option, we can connect them to colleagues who might help them share their stories on the website, social media, or through campaigning. So to finish, I hope this shows how focusing on the stages across the journey helps us to see beyond the research engagement. I think it means we can notice some of the interactions that are often less considered, which still to a participant or someone who's taking part in research, it's all part of the same experience. At RNID, we're continuing to find opportunities for where we can improve across the journey. And I think what's both exciting and challenging is how each project or person who takes part in research presents new opportunities for us to improve the way that we do things. So thanks very much for your time, and thank you to Magnify for having me.
Thank you, Tyler, for your amazing presentation. I saw people in the chat asking for a link to the consent form, so it seemed that there's a lot of people interested in knowing about it. So thanks again. And I'm asking to see if there's anyone who has questions as well for both Tyler and Emma. So feel free to write them down in the chat or in the Q&A portion. And now we're just going to move to a break session again. It's going to be 10 minutes. And so what if we meet again by, let's say, is it 4:35? I believe it is 4:35 in London. So 4:35 4:45 in 10 minutes, we will come back again and reunite so that we can listen to the last portion of the session, which is the Q&A, and learn a lot more from the presentation and kind of expand on certain subjects. So, all right, so yes, let's meet at 4:45, which is 10 minutes from now. All right, see you soon. All right, everyone, we are back. It's now 4:45 and we're ready to respond to some questions from the audience to the speakers. So let's see. I wanted to start by asking Marissa if she's still here and she's willing to answer questions from the audience. So I'm thinking, do you have maybe 1 or 2 questions that you already responded to that you want to kind of give a different response, or you want to respond to publicly to the rest of the group? Or do you have any additional questions that you haven't had the time to answer? And if so, if you choose 1 or 2 of those questions, when you are about to answer them, can you just like tell it, like say it out loud so that everyone can hear it as well? And that would be super helpful. So Marissa.
Great, sure. So the question that I want to answer, which I have to now find again, is from Laura. So Laura says, can you speak a bit about the balance of approaching research through the friendship approach versus as a researcher? I'm curious about your thoughts around the tension of showing up as a friend to make people feel comfortable while keeping healthy boundaries and the transparency of research in place. This is a really good question, and it's something which I thought about a lot during this project. So in the talk, I mentioned some people that have spoken about this. So Lisa Tillman-Healy and Carolyn Ellis are both researchers that have spoken a lot about kind of friendship as method and kind of being friends with participants and kind of pros and cons. I think ultimately, I think it's about differentiating between being friendly, as in being welcoming, smiling, as opposed to treating someone as a friend in the sense of treating them with the level of respect and consideration that you would give to your friends. And those are kind of 2 totally different things, right? It's like giving someone kind of respect for their privacy, respecting their space. It's a kind of a different sense of friend other than kind of like smiling and you know, like having a cheerful conversation. I think also letting them take the lead in the conversation, not necessarily assuming that you will actually be friends with this person, although you might be friends. Like I became friends with some of my participants, but not necessarily assuming that that would be an outcome. I think reflecting on your experiences afterwards can also be really helpful. I talked about research journaling, and that can actually be, I think, a really useful way to unpack some of your feelings towards this person, because you might also not like some of your participants. So that's kind of almost the reverse situation where you discover that you have a kind of maybe even a rational dislike to somebody. So kind of unpacking that is like, well, why do I feel this particular way, either liking, disliking about somebody, and kind of helping to reflect on that and how that might color some of your experiences when you're talking to them and how you might, how you are interacting with them, I guess.
Awesome. Do you have any other questions that you would like to answer, or maybe a comment? When you think?
Sure. If I have time, I'll talk about another one. So another question that I got was from Angie. So she asks, I was wondering if you had any experience or advice for making a safe space when the initial topic isn't necessarily emotional or sensitive, but then the conversation turns that way. So example I'm thinking of is when talking with someone about a product they use that might be ubiquitous, such as video streaming services, but then that brings out emotions or a conversation about divorce or death of a family member. And even more important for the researcher to not be objectively distant from the participant to feel comfortable. So Yeah, this is a really tough one. And I think my thought on this is to, I guess, never assume that a conversation will be neutral or fine. So if we go into the research situations kind of assuming that people, our duty is to always set up that safe, secure space for the participant, no matter what kind of conversations that we're having with them, because we don't know what they will tell us. So I think if we go into it with that assumption, then if something like that does come out, then we've kind of already created that safe space for that to happen. So then that kind of gives them, freedom to say whatever they want. I also talked a bit about kind of dynamic consent, and I think that's really important here, because checking back in with them, or even letting them go away and then getting back to them afterwards, to allow them to kind of review what happened during the session after they've maybe had a bit of time to think about it, to give them the freedom to choose not to include things is really important, because then they could tell you things safely, knowing that they can say things to you personally as a person off the record without feeling like it's being included in the research. So I think that's really important. And again, that's kind of that friendship thing I was talking about, is like they're a real person, not a research subject. So treating them that way and with respect is really important. So yeah.
Thank you, Marissa. If you have questions for her, I believe you can get in touch with her as well. If she provided like contact information, such as email, etc. Now we're going to move to both of our speakers who presented together on designing for social taboos, Ankita and Apoorva. If you have one or two questions that you would like to tackle for everyone, feel free to go ahead.
Thanks, and so sorry, there's some glitch with my video, so I'll just keep that off. The question for now that we'd like to take is by Imran. Just reading the question. He is asking, great talk, Ankita and Apoorva. It's so good to hear how your service is protecting the vulnerable, people who provide care for children with type 1 diabetes. What tips and advice would you have in how to build trust with your user groups? Being from a South Asian background myself, living in the UK, communities where English is a second language can be a barrier for these types of citizens to engage with the service. Really interested in how you overcame this. Hi, Imran. First of all, this was, I think, one of our biggest barriers that we faced. And this connects back to what Marissa was just saying. So we just began by not looking at them as research subjects, but looking at them as friends, as people. And the first thing that really helped us break the ice was sharing a similar story. So I happen to have a sister who's impacted by type 1. That was actually our breakthrough. Before that, we were trying to reach out to people and we had no luck. But the minute we put out that story, people were able to relate, and we actually had a lot of participants for the workshop. So we knew that more than just trying to promote or just trying to talk about what we were doing, it was important to be able to understand what they were feeling and resonate with that and empathize before just telling them that we have a solution for you. And other than that, I think Apoorva has brilliantly mentioned all of the other things that we did once we had the mothers on board, which was, taking our time to build that trust, having conversations. So we made sure in our workshops, it was not just informational and not just about type 1, but there were some icebreakers, which was beyond that, and just talking about things that they do other than, taking care of the child and what their interests were, having some games in the middle to make sure it wasn't getting very monotonous. So all of these activities actually really helped build that trust within the mothers and us as well. So it was kind of like capacity building beyond just the problem that we were looking at, that really helped us create the safe space and a supportive environment. So I think that's the question from my end. If Apoorva wants to take the other question, if we have time, I'm more than happy for her to take it up.
All right. I believe we have 5 minutes before the official closing of the conference. And so I'm thinking that maybe we can move to our next speakers. And if we have time, we can respond to a few other questions. But thank you so much, both of you, for being able to respond to some of these questions. So we're going to move on to ask Emma if she's willing to kind of mention one question on her topic, Let's Talk About Sex.
Hi everyone, yeah, sure. So I had a question from someone who was anonymous that said, "Hi Emma, amazing presentation. So many designers I know shy away from the tech side because it's intimidating or feels boring. Do you have any tips for designers who feel intimidated by this area? How can we gain confidence as designers to work with developers better?" Which I think is a really good question, and actually something I sometimes touch on when I do the talk, because it did make me think about that a lot. Like the solution that we came up with wouldn't have worked if tech and design hadn't collaborated really closely together. And I do often see designers kind of only really concerned with kind of what's on the surface on the screen, and they're almost a bit too scared to kind of lean into what happens when someone pushes that button or does that thing. I mean, the only advice I'd give really is to just try not to be scared. There's nothing to be scared of. It's just learning. It's yeah, it might feel out of your comfort zone, but it will strengthen your practice if you develop expertise in this area. No one's expecting you to be an expert, but to understand how it works is really important. And I think just look out for people who you can collaborate with in that area. I had a great technical architect that I worked really closely with through that project, and we learned a lot from each other, and the relationship was really mutually beneficial. So I would recommend that. But thank you for the question, because it was definitely something that was on my mind through the project.
Amazing answer. Thank you so much. And I would like to ask Tyler, do you have any question that you want to respond to?
Hi. Yes. Can you hear me? Great. Yes, I got a question from an anonymous person. And they asked, when doing research specifically at RNID, what has changed about the research tools you have used to be inclusive to people who are deaf or have a hearing impairment? Sometimes these changes seem so obvious, but we don't think of them. Yeah, I think that the tools that we use have changed or might be slightly different to ones other people use, or the ways we use them is probably what's shifted the most. One example that I often kind of surface is the ways we adapt usability testing, or like the testing of a thing that we need to show somebody when we do research with someone who uses British Sign Language as a first language. So someone who uses BSL as a first language will need to have access to an interpreter during a session. And that kind of means that the way that we run a session, like the cadence of the session and the kind of schedule changes, because if we kind of ask someone to look through a prototype, they won't kind of be able to see their interpreter while they're also looking at the prototype. So we'll adapt and say things like upfront, like, okay, we're going to show you this thing, and we'll have a conversation about what they might expect to see. And then we'll have them kind of silently look at the thing that we're testing, and then we'll come back and we'll all have a chat. So we're prioritizing their access to an interpreter as opposed to like the way that we're used to doing things. And so it's not necessarily about the tool, but it's about kind of the way we use the tools, like Zoom in that example. And I think a lot of the people we do research with that have hearing loss are older, they have age-related hearing loss, and they might be less confident using digital tools. And right now we're all working remotely. And so we have to consider like which tools we use and what is the easiest way of doing that, and whether someone brings along a support system like their son, for example, to an interview to set up the call. There's lots of different ways that we can kind of adapt the way we use the tools.
Thank you for that answer, Tyler. We're now at the very end of our day and the conference. I am really happy that I joined and grateful for all the presentations and all the faces and everything that happened here in terms of conversations and discussions. Thank you to all the speakers who joined and were so kind to answer the questions and to be present. And thanks to Claudia, who's the amazing organizer and creator of Magnify Conference. And I was wondering, she's open to a few words before we close, and maybe we can also have a little bit of time to discuss and answer a few questions if there's any left. So Claudia.
Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay, great. There's also a car alarm coming on, so if you hear that, that's what that is. But I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for joining. This was kind of a passion project that grew during lockdown boredom and took me to this moment. So I just want to thank everyone who's bought a ticket, all the speakers and the workshop facilitators and panelists, because during those months of putting it together, all of their ideas were what drove me forward and kept me motivated to do this. I'd also like to thank Anne-Marie, Laura Halloran, and Babak Sadat, as they were the hosts and allowed me to be on the back end throughout the whole conference. So that was really great. And I'd also like to say thank you to Fable, who are our sponsors, and they ensured that we could offer honorariums to all of the speakers and facilitators. So thank you to everyone who came out. Yeah, I think that's it from me.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining. Yes, I guess now it's like an open-ended session and I have a call right at the very end. But I will answer later.
Thank you everyone for your comments. That's really great to hear. I think also for those who are still here, one thing that I was interested in was how people at the workshops were saying how helpful it was for people to come together and have that moment to discuss. So I'm also looking into ideas of how we can make this lower scale, but continue those conversations. So if you're still interested in that, let me know and we'll see what we can do. Something that doesn't take as much as my time, but everyone can equally contribute. So yeah, we'll see what rolls out in the next few months. Okay, great. I'll close the session now, but you're all in favor, so that's great to hear, and we'll keep it going. Wonderful. Okay, bye everyone.
Everyone.